Song for a Whale, Chapter 38. Sura wanted to stay on board, but told the crew at the exit that Benny could go with Grandma and me into the icy harbor. Benny hadn't been to the junkyard before, but she knew it wasn't close to where the cruise ship stopped. Not much of a tourist attraction. It wasn't really a junkyard, but more of a dump, which was even better since I wouldn't have to pay for anything. But it could be messy since people dropped off trash there. A couple of shuttles were parked near the harbor, ready to take passengers to whatever there was to see in town. Benny and I took a seat up front after boarding a shuttle, and Grandma asked the driver, "The dump, please," as if it was totally normal request from a tourist. I don't know what he said to her, but she handed him some money from her purse, and it looked like she said, "It's important." She took a seat then, across from Benny and me. Benny was right. There wasn't much in that town. A few people got out when the shuttle driver stopped at a bar, and more got out at an area that had some shops and a fishing pier. About 10 minutes later, the driver pulled up to the icy harbor dump. Grandma signed at the same time she talked to the driver. "We won't be long. Will you wait for us?" He checked his watch and held up 10 fingers, then waved a hand around like he was tracing a road. He had his route he had to get back to. Whether or not this place had what I needed, 10 minutes was enough time to figure that out. The dump looked sort of like Moe's Junk Emporium, but with more things in piles. Maybe that was stuff no one wanted. Instead of a trailer for an office, there was an old school bus that was more rust colored than yellow. Next to the bus stood a rickety wooden shed with the word paint in red letters over the entrance, and a dead appliance section like at Moe's. A man with a bright red face and small eyes stepped off the bus office. He looked like a lobster who had transformed into a human. Also, he looked like he probably ate at restaurants like the Cattle Prod. He and Mo would be good friends. As I ran up to him, he started to say something, and I pointed to my ear and showed him a list I'd written out. His blue work shirt had "Giblet" embroidered on the pocket. Grandma and Benny came up after me. Giblet touched the first item on the list, a radio, then pointed to a plywood structure with an electronics sign. I asked Grandma to look around for some kind of plastic container to hold the speaker parts. A small cooler would work if I could seal the lids closed somehow. Something smaller than that I could carry in my backpack would be easier. A PVC pipe would work as long as it had cap pieces to seal off the ends. I'd have to drill a hole in it somehow for the wires to poke through. Benny ran with me to the electronics shed. Before going in, I pushed on the side a little to make sure it wasn't going to topple over with us in it. Looking over all the scattered electronics made me miss my room again. It didn't matter that I'd never let my collection get so disorganized, or that most of it wasn't in my room anymore. Right then, I missed it all. I missed home. I wanted to see my parents and Tristan. I wanted to visit the antique shop and see if my Philco was still there. I wanted to see Mr. Gunner. If it hadn't been that long since I'd been inside the store, but so much had happened since then. It was hard to imagine everything at home staying the same while so much had happened with me. Benny waved to snap me back to our time-limited shopping trip. The radios and stereos at the dump weren't nearly as old as what I usually repaired, but that was good. Tearing into a boombox from the 1980s wouldn't bother me like pulling a speaker out of an antique radio would. I turned a boombox around and twisted a finger to show Benny I wanted to take out the screws. She gave me a thumbs up and ran back to Giblet. While I waited for Benny, I looked around the piles of stuff for something smaller. The boombox speaker could work, but it was bigger than I wanted. Whatever I ended up making, I'd have to carry it with me to Lighthouse Bay if we did get there on time. In the corner of the shed, I found the perfect thing, a handheld cassette player. People played music on them before CDs and long before we could download music on computers and phones. Benny came back with Grandma and gave me the screwdriver. Grandma handed me the plastic thermos. It wasn't the kind you'd pour the drink out of into a mug, but the kind that was like a tall cup with a lid, a hinged spout lifted up for drinking. I checked later to make sure no water would get in. It could be exactly what I needed. After removing the speaker from the cassette player, I slid it into the thermos. It fit by a hair. The wires would thread through the drinking hole, and I thanked Grandma and Benny, then stuck the thermos in my backpack and signed headphones. They glanced around the shed with me until Benny picked up a tangled uh, set of headphones that was like a pile of thin snakes. I held my backpack open for her to throw in the whole bundle. I'd only need one set. But there wasn't time for untangling, and it was always good to have a spare. From there, I ran toward a pile of pipes and overturned toilets. Next to a rusty pipe, a few tubes of leftover caulk. The ones without caps wouldn't be any good. The caulk inside would have been dried up. I picked up two that were still capped. Each one felt like it had more than I needed. One was white caulk that people used for the edges of sinks and bathtubs, and the other was a clear silicone kind. I uncapped the clear tube and squeezed out a bit to check that it hadn't dried out. Then recapped it and threw it into my backpack. Benny turned toward the shuttle, then looked back at me, pantomiming a honking horn. Grandma waved to the driver and held up a finger, asking him to wait another minute for us. Happy as I was to find the dump, I didn't want to get abandoned there. Giblet walked over to see how we were doing, and I pointed to the last item on my list. The wire I could salvage from the electronics, there wouldn't be enough. I needed long strands of wire. He waved for me to follow him. I told Grandma and Benny to go ahead to the shuttle and that I'd meet them back there in a minute. Giblet led me to a section of big wooden spools. He tapped a wire-wrapped spool, then held up a hand to his ear as if it were a telephone. I knelt down and held the end of the wire, which was coated with black plastic for insulation. Perfect. The spool looked like it held hundreds of feet of wire when it was full. Not much was left, but it still had a lot more than I needed. I signed, "Thank you," while mouthing the words to Giblet, then unrolled the wire from the spool. With the bundle of black wire wrapped around my hand, I ran and leaped onto the shuttle for the ride back to the cruise ship. I had my waterproof speaker. Now I just had to put it together.